speaker this evening, David Makovsky, who was gracious enough to be with us this evening. I only discovered, sitting in my office, tonight is his wedding anniversary. So let's start by singing Happy Anniversary. Happy Anniversary. We welcome all of you as the Merkaz Dahan Center for Jewish Life and Learning embarks on another wonderful season with this, our annual Stanley Zealot Penn Memorial Lecture. It was on June 23rd, 1997 that Stanley Penn was taken from us. He was taken from us all too suddenly and all too soon. He had so much to live for with such a wonderful family, a family which this year grew larger when his grandson, Joe Carolina, who today is celebrating his 25th birthday, got married. Joe was named for Stanley's father, and it was more than coincidental that he and his lovely bride were products of Beth Tfiloh and met here. Stanley was a very special man, a smart businessman, a devoted family man, a sincere shul mensch. It's hard to believe that it's already 15 years since he is gone. But we still remember him due in part to his wife Helene, a very special lady in her own right, who endowed this lecture in Stanley's memory, making sure that while he was gone, he would never be forgotten. There was another act of charity and generosity on Helene's part to perpetuate Stanley's memory that I participated in. I stood with her when we dedicated a plaque in Stanley's memory at the Diaspora Museum in Tel Aviv. The Diaspora Museum is a very special place linking Israel with the rest of the Jewish world. Our speaker tonight personifies that link. No matter where a Jew may live, his eyes and heart are focused on Israel, especially in these challenging times when Israel faces an existential threat from a nuclear Iran. So much has been said on this subject, but who knows what to believe? Will Israel strike? Will it strike alone? Do Obama and Netanyahu see eye to eye? All sorts of questions and all sorts of answers, but who knows who to believe? I was struck this year when Leslie Geld made a rather remarkable statement. Leslie Geld is currently the President Emeritus of the Council on Foreign Relations. He's generally acknowledged as one of our country's most widely respected experts on diplomacy and international affairs. So his words mean something. And here's what he said. I'm not supposed to tell you this. I'm violating the code. I'm giving away the deepest, darkest secret of the foreign policy clan. Even though we sound like we know everything, we know very little. Especially about the intentions of bad guys and the consequences of war. But since the media keeps treating us like sages and keeps ignoring our horrendous mistakes, we carry on with our game and do a lot of damage. Tonight, I'm happy to tell you that we have a foreign affairs expert who knows what he's talking about. And he has proven it again and again, most recently in his much talked about feature article in the New Yorker magazine on Israel's bombing of Syria's nuclear reactor. A graduate of Columbia and Harvard University, David Makovsky has all sorts of titles. Listen to this one. The Ziegler Distinguished Fellow and Director of the Middle East Peace Process at the Washington Institute. Pish posh. But more than that, I can tell you I've read his books. I know his history as executive editor of the Jerusalem Post and diplomatic correspondent for Haaretz. I know his writings in the U.S. News and World Report. I've heard him speak. And I know that he knows what he's talking about. And I also know that he's a heck of a nice guy, and I'm honored to introduce to you Mr. David Makovsky.
Rabbi, I'm very, very touched to be here. You know, they say that I wish my parents would have heard it. You know, my father would have loved it, and my mother would have believed it. So, but I'm very honored to be here, Rabbi. This synagogue is known far and wide, and it's a great honor for me to be here among so many of you, and to be here for the Penn lecture. Helene Penn-Dorf, in memory of Stanley Ziegler Penn, and it's really an honor to be here. And I take this opportunity as a fanatic baseball fan to salute Baltimore for an amazing year. I teach on the side at Johns Hopkins. They have a graduate school in Washington called the School of Advanced International Studies. And there's a congregant of yours that comes to my class every year, and that's David Bernstein. And one year I taught in the Bernstein building, and then I realized that's the David Bernstein building. And he's always been so generous, and it was kind of him to come. He's not feeling well, but it was so nice of him to come earlier this evening to say hello, and I wanted to salute him personally, on the Orioles. He's always so generous to my son on his birthday, and that's how, you know, my kids, even though we don't live in Baltimore, we still root for them because of David Bernstein. So it's an honor to be here. All right, let's get to the Middle East. And the Rabbi was very so generous and to mention this piece I wrote in the New Yorker. So let me start with a story. I was very curious, you know, to really do like what we would call a deep dive and then do some excavation on Israel's strike on the nuclear reactor in Syria in 2007. And I was fortunate enough to interview like 25 people who were really in the thick of this decision on both sides of the ocean. And it's very important always to talk to all sides so you never, you know, rely just on one version of events. And the story that was striking was that, you know, I'll bring you to April 18th, 2007, when Israel had just broken in a month and a half earlier into Vienna. It turns out that the head of the Syrian nuclear agency has a second home in Vienna. He was there for the International Atomic Energy Board of Governors meeting, and while he was out, Mossad basically went into his home and took from his laptop all the data, about 30 or 40 photos inside, and from the laptop that were inside the reactor that was being built secretly. And right now on Israel's doorstep. It was on the eastern desert, the northeastern desert, so it wasn't really on the border, but it was something that Israel thought it would know about. And it was astonished by the finding. And Israel had all these internal meetings, and finally they said, we got to go to the Americans. We got to tell the Americans what we found. We got to bring them the photographs. And sure enough, they get there on April 18th to the office of National Security Advisor Steve Hadley, and it was Dagan, the head of the Mossad, who we wish him well. He just has gone through a liver transplant this week, and he's in a very serious condition. But he came and he met with Hadley, and he met with also Michael Hayden, the head of the CIA. And they said, here are the photographs. There's a reactor being built secretly that none of us knew about. And this is huge. This is one of the big events. You know, Israel faced an Iraqi reactor in 1981, but since 1981, Israel hasn't faced anything like that. So George Bush says, you know, he tasks the CIA and says, you gotta verify this. Is it true or not? And after the whole Iraq War, which I don't have to tell this audience how controversial it was, did they have weapons of mass destruction or not? He says you gotta keep it secret, but you gotta be secret and you gotta be sure. You can't have a huge task force on this, but you gotta check it out. And what they did was they took what they call the handhelds, the photos, and they superimposed American satellite imagery, and they took that to something called NGA or NGIA, I think it's called NGA actually, but it's the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, to see if there's a congruence between the photos that Israel brought, to make sure they weren't doctored in any way, maybe not by Israel, but by somebody else who wanted to mislead Israel, and the satellite photography. And they built the computer model at the NGA, and what they found is that it checked out, and that they sent it to the nuclear lab, one of the nuclear labs of the Department of Energy. They showed it to an outside expert. The CIA was very nervous because you don't want to get this wrong, especially after what happened over this controversy over the WMD. And they reported back to the president and said, Mr. President, Israelis are telling you the truth. It's real. This is a nuclear reactor. And, but the problem was that there was a little piece of this that they could not find. And it's called the reprocessing plant for weaponization. The CIA did a meeting at what's called the Yellow Oval, which was in the residence of the president. There's a room where he likes to have informal meetings on weekends. And they said, Hayden said, high confidence, Mr. President, that this is a reactor. And it's not for energy, it's not near Aleppo, it's not near Damascus or anything. But low confidence is that we can't find this one piece. And we don't see there would be any other purpose for this, because it doesn't serve any energy purposes, because it's not near any Syrian city. Bottom line, the president was concerned. And in the middle of this, Ehud Olmert comes on June 19th under the guise of bilateral talks, but basically pled Israel's case on June 19th and said, Mr. President, your experts have said this is a reactor. You should take this out, Mr. President. And he said, let me think about it and I'll get back to you. I got to consult some more. And on July 13th, there was a phone call the president made with his advisors there, and said, Ehud, I'm sorry, to Ehud Olmert, the prime minister, but we can't help you, basically, because until we find that reprocessing plant, maybe it's in Syria, they're not letting us do inspections like we did in Iraq, we can't say that that's what it is. Of course you're right, there's no other reason for it. And he came forward with a diplomatic idea of send Condoleezza Rice, have a press conference, tell the Syrians, you got to remove this in 72 hours or we're going to take you to the Security Council. Olmert responded on the phone and said, Mr. President, I can't do that, don't you understand? Once we go public with this information, it's over. Then, we have lost the element of surprise. And, we can't do this. They'll put a kindergarten there. They will put anti-aircraft batteries there. And there'll be nothing we can do. Don't you understand that we're in a bind? And he said, look, either you do this or we'll do it. And I think of this sometimes. Now there's a lot of differences between Syria and Iran. But this story to me illustrates how people can look at the same facts and reach different conclusions. Now my hope is the countries reach the same conclusions. I'd like to see this issue solved peacefully. That would be my preference, if it's at all possible. No one wants to use force, and there's no warmongers in this story. There's no Curtis LeMays who want to firebomb Tehran or anything like that, the way Curtis LeMay did with Tokyo in the Second World War. But the question I keep thinking in my head is, how the Syria story, same facts, opposite conclusions. And in the case of Syria, America was preoccupied. Basically, Robert Gates was the Secretary of Defense. And he had just started something called the Surge, which was to bring in a lot of troops into Iraq. And he believed, you could only focus on one issue at a time. And he told an aide of his, half-jokingly, every administration's allowed one preemptive strike against a Muslim country, we've had ours. And you know, we got to focus on making the surge work. If you do this thing in Syria, the Syrians might allow jihadis to cross the Syrian-Iraqi border and kill Americans. And so, you know, we don't want that. A woman, Condoleezza Rice, the Secretary of State, she was focused on six-party talks with North Korea. If you hit the North Korean reactor in Syria, the odds are your talks might not go so well. She said she didn't want to mess that up. So each one had a very legitimate reason for their priorities. It just wasn't Israel's priority. They had another idea. It's not like they were ignoring Israel, but it was an idea that Israel felt was not gonna succeed. So I only bring that story to tell you that as different as the Syrian-Iranian issue is, and it's different in many ways, the Iranian issue is so public, it's not an element of surprise in that way. It's on every newspaper in the world. This isn't about a reactor. In the case of a reactor, Olmert's fear was the reactor goes hot. It was going hot that in 2007. It was 700 yards away from the Euphrates River. If you hit a hot reactor, you know, there's contamination, and God forbid kids or anybody living near the Euphrates that rely on the Euphrates for a water source, they will blame Israel till the end of time. So that was, you know, there are differences. I want to be clear, but at the same time, I want to say that as many differences as there were, the issue is what do you know and when do you know it, and you know, will you act on what you know? And the Syria case was a case of where the U.S. and Israel, same facts, opposite conclusions. So where does this leave us on Iran? I would say on Iran there's a shared objective. It's clear that the U.S. and Israel, and nobody wants Iran to have a nuclear weapon. Not the Europeans. I think if any of us would have predicted that the Europeans would oppose the amount of sanctions that they've done in the last few years, very few in my view would have predicted it. But actually there's a pretty broad consensus that Iran with a nuclear weapon fundamentally changes the balance of power in the Middle East. And that's true for a variety of reasons. Of course, Israel feels it in the most acute sense. Jewish history teaches Israel that when your enemies say they want to kill you, you got to believe them. And that is a lesson that a country who lives on a knife's edge, has a dark past, and with the Holocaust, you know, it has to take these threats seriously. So, and Israel's the only one being threatened with its being annihilated. And this isn't just Ahmadinejad or Khamenei. The chief of staff of the military just used those words. We're committed to the full annihilation of Israel. He said it just a few months ago. Not to mention that Ahmadinejad and Khamenei say wipe Israel off the map, or it's a cancer, we're going to excise the tumor very soon. So you got to take those things seriously. But don't believe Israel. I've talked to two foreign ministers from the Persian Gulf in settings over the last year or so, who have said to me, Iran with a bomb means that we will come under their sway. They will dictate oil, certainly, and they will intimidate the moderates, and they will embolden the extremists. And for the United States, our signature issues, one of our signature issues since the end of World War II, is nuclear non-proliferation. And Iran with a bomb means that the most dangerous part of the world, the Middle East, becomes a lot more dangerous. Because if the Shia Persians have a bomb, the Arabs, with all their enmity, Arab versus Persian, they are going to say, what? The Shia Persians get a bomb, but we don't? We're Saudi Arabia. We're an important country. And they have a relationship already with the Pakistani bomb, I should say. And the Turks, they might not be Arab, but they're Muslim, Sunni in the neighborhood. And their view is, why should the Shia have it? And the Egyptians, they're broke right now with their revolution, but ultimately they're going to say, we're the most important Arab country, we have 85 million people, why did the Shia get it and we don't? So you're going to take the most dangerous region, and it's going to become so much more dangerous. And what we call in America the NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, a pillar of American foreign policy since World War II, I think that's thrown in the dustbin. And that's not a small matter. So there's the Israel piece, but it goes beyond Israel. There's the nuclear non-proliferation piece, and we don't know who these people proliferate to. Hezbollah is their proxy. Can they proliferate to a non-state actor? Dirty bomb technology. That's no small issue either. So I think that these, and then like I said, these Arab countries, they're afraid that they will dominate the Gulf. They will set the price of oil, moderates will be afraid, and we will see a profound change in the balance of power. So for all those reasons, and the president gave a speech on March 4th, where he said a lot of the same things. And our policy cannot be containment. Now what is containment? If you remember in the Cold War, the Soviet Union, we had a policy of containment, which is we don't mind if they have the bomb, but as long as we contain them. But there are a lot of elements that exist in the Cold War that don't exist here. We had 500,000 troops of NATO in Germany, in places like that, remember? We don't have that in the Middle East. So there's no NATO. And that was the basis, was an anti-Soviet alliance that way. There was basically, you had embassies that existed, between Moscow and Washington. You had hotlines since the Cuban Missile Crisis. You don't have, in the case of Tehran and Israel, there are no embassies, there's no hotlines, there's not communication. And you've had some radical statements by Rafsanjani, who's the supposed leading pragmatic person, saying, if we fire one bomb at Israel, it destroys that country, but if they fire back at us, we only lose a part of our country. You got to take that seriously. And even if you're saying it's hyperbolic, and even if you assume they're rational, rational does not mean reasonable. You can still be a so-called rationalist, but you can be reckless too. You can miscalculate. And we almost had miscalculations during the Cuban Missile Crisis. I was just with Graham Allison, who wrote this famous book on the Cuban Missile Crisis at Harvard this weekend, and he called this Israel-Iran thing the Cuban Missile Crisis in slow motion. So this is a new thing that we're dealing with. So I think the good news is that there is a sense internationally that they should not be allowed to get that bomb. And but the not as good news is that the containment idea that maybe worked with the Soviet Union, and you're dealing with atheists, communists, it's unclear if it works in this context. And when you have all sorts of proxies, Hezbollah, Hamas, all sorts of groups, you don't have anything like that in the US-Soviet context. So I think that that analogy doesn't hold. And therefore the question is, well, if you share the strategy, if you share the objective that Iran doesn't get a bomb, what is the strategy to make sure you get to your objective? And I think here, the hope is, the first hope is that you have a mix of sanctions and diplomacy. That you hope that by squeezing Iran, but offering them a deal, diplomacy with pressure might yield something. No guarantees it will work though. But the feeling is it's worth a try, and Israel's been basically supportive of that approach. And the sanctions has gone beyond what we thought. And ban on oil, a focus on shutting down their financial sector and their access to foreign investment. It is estimated that inflation in Iran is running at about 70%, 7-0. They've just devalued what they call the rial, the Iranian currency, by about 30 to 40% in the last few weeks. And that comes on top of another devaluation. And they've had some riots in the streets. But so far, the program itself keeps on ticking. And it could be because the leaders, they don't care what their public is suffering. And therefore, things that might work in a democratic setting don't work here. So we have no way of knowing that by sanctions, this will lead to them halting their program. Now, I expect whoever wins the president in these elections here, which I know there's a lot of interest in, I expect whoever wins is going to make a diplomatic push. to try to see if there's a way to solve it peacefully, because whether you use force or not, you clearly want to try some sort of grand deal that would lead to Iran pulling back. Now, will that work? Was that preferred strategy that everyone would like? Solve it peacefully, diplomacy, sanctions. Can that work? It's very unclear that will work. I wish the diplomacy that we've been engaged in the last few months, that we were more ambitious, that we cut to the bottom lines much faster in knowing what the deal is. And that means that they have to ship out all their stockpiles for the most part. Are they going to do that? Except for a few hundred grams for like face saving. They've incurred a lot of sanctions. It's unclear to me that they're going to go along with anything like this. So now, if the U.S. and Israel are united in an objective and united in a preferred strategy, if things are so good, what could be bad? Okay, here's the problem. While everyone's in sync on the objective and the strategy, they're not in sync about capabilities. And that's because the U.S. and Israel have different capabilities. Israel is a regional power. It's not a superpower. Its capabilities are potent, but finite. The United States, we here are a superpower, and by being a superpower, we think this gives us more time to let the sanctions, the squeezing, have an impact, and let the diplomacy see if that could bear fruit. Israel has a tighter time frame for action because it's not a superpower. It does not have what they call a MOP. A MOP is, I don't even read about this in the press, it's not always written about, but it's not classified or anything. The MOP is the Massive Ordnance Penetrator. It's a 30,000-pound bomb that can be dropped from a B-2 bomber and that could go through a mountain. And the fuse is supposed to explode at the bottom of the mountain. Why is this focus always on a mountain? Because one of their clandestine places, which they claim is for civilian nuclear power, is in this place called Fordo. Fordo is a mountain 30 kilometers, about 20 miles outside of Qom. Qom is their religious city. And they have got a program inside a mountain. They claim it's civilian. Why it has to be inside a mountain if it's civilian under the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, I think raises a lot of questions. But to get inside that mountain, you can't just use the bunker busters that you think, because this is very deep in the mountain. And therefore, that has been a source of problem. Israel doesn't have a MOP, doesn't have this 30,000-pound bomb, this massive ordnance penetrator. It doesn't have B-2 bombers, doesn't know how to fly them, doesn't have the runways for them to carry a 30,000-pound bomb, because it's too heavy for an F-15 and F-16. So this creates issues. Now, Israel is a very inventive country, creative, and in the case of Syria, for example, it did things that the United States might not have done, which was it thought of a psychological insight, which was if we go into the Syria reactor with only 8 planes and we never take credit for it, so long as this thing is in a desert somewhere, as long as Assad could deny that the reactor even exists, he doesn't have to retaliate. That was the insight of psychologists in Israel. It's called miluim. Miluim means the reserve duty of soldiers who had to be psychologists, and they got together and they thought this was the insight of Bashar al-Assad, which is don't announce it, don't crow about it, don't put the guy in the corner, don't rub his nose in it. Do what you have to do and get out. And don't do it with 100 planes, do it with 8. And that worked. And that was the insight that helped Israel. And again, Iran is different. But I'm saying that sometimes Israel is inventive and creative, and I wouldn't say it wouldn't be here. But what I'm saying is the clocks are not in sync between Washington and Jerusalem because of this mismatch of capabilities militarily. Israel has to make a tighter call in a narrower time, and therefore doesn't have the luxury for a long decision-making time frame. So that's where we are. Now the question is, given the differences, what's happened? Why have things seem like they've gotten out of hand lately between the U.S. and Israel on this issue? I think that I felt that on one hand, that it was, you talk to cabinet ministers, you talk to generals. When it comes to operational issues, I try to be very cautious not to ask certain questions. But I still felt that it was heading in a certain direction, even before the American elections. But because it was a belief that Israel's ability to maximize its leverage, frankly, was at its peak before an American election instead of after it. Because the candidates would be somewhat constrained in however they saw an Israeli action. But I think what happened is the defense establishment in Israel, led by Ehud Barak, the defense minister, was feeling increasingly queasy about this and said, if we interpose ourselves before an American election, we will never live this down. And I can tell you, I'm about to write an article about this, so I'm giving you an advance preview. In 1956 was something called the Suez Crisis. That was the Sinai campaign, is called in Israel, Mivtza Kadesh. And it was really the French foreign minister who hit before an American election because they thought Eisenhower was going to go in a different direction after the election. And Ben Gurion, who went along with the British and the French, but colluded in a way, but without telling the Americans. The worst year in U.S.-Israel relations, in the history of U.S.-Israel relations, was 1957. In other words, what you did before the election, frankly, wasn't insulated before the election, but rather the price was after the election. And I think that the defense establishment felt you don't do this, you don't want to interject yourself. Let's keep trying, let's keep working with the Americans, let's see what we can do, let's see what's possible. And I think that's what prevailed. Now, I don't want to get too much, I'm not a nuclear physicist, and I don't want your eyes to glaze over here, but for a minute I just got to tell you about why it's important for you to understand a couple of the principles here, which is what's at stake. The hardest part of building a nuclear weapon is nuclear fuel. And the question is, will Iran be able to use that fuel for a bomb? Now, it already has Shihab missiles to carry it, but it needs also a warhead. Now, warhead can be done in secret. Iran is a massive country. You'll never be able to find that warhead. It's kind of like the reprocessing plant in the case of Syria, I would argue. But what they can do is track the nuclear fuel. That is trackable. And the belief is that by next June, Iran will have enough nuclear fuel. You've all seen that picture of Netanyahu at the UN. It's become an iconic image with the red marker saying if they get enough fuel for what is known as enriched uranium that is reactor grade, once they get a bomb's worth of what we call 20% enriched uranium, it's only 4 to 6 weeks that they can convert that and break out of that into what's called weapons-grade uranium. So to go from 20% uranium to, a layman in the audience would say 20% sounds to me a fifth of the way, but it's really 90% of the way, because 4 to 6 weeks, they can convert it into a highly enriched uranium. And we should be honest, our ability to track this stuff is not ideal. We rely on the International Atomic Energy Agency that goes once a month or once in 6 weeks to this mountain called Fordo and goes to this place called Natanz and basically asks for the film from the Iranians so it can be processed in Vienna. But it's not like there's a 24/7. It's not like there's all this advanced technology that would exist everywhere else. But the Iranians have said, well, we said you could have film, but we didn't say that you would automatically beam it back. No, you collect the film once a month, and we'll give you the film. And so it could be, if this is a 6-week period, they might say it's Ramadan this month. It's a holy month of Ramadan. You IAEA people from Vienna, come back in another month. All right? We can't really track it that well. Americans would like to think we're on top of everything. We're not, and we rely on this, and we don't have that access. So we're relying on film from the IAEA once a month, to go to Natanz, to go to Fordo, but we don't know what's going to be. So where does this leave us? Netanyahu gets nervous and says, well, wait a while. If by June they've got enough that they can, 6 weeks, convert this stuff very quickly, you know, how will we know? They will wait. They're not in a hurry, the Iranians. They'll wait for some crisis in the world, an equivalent of a surge somewhere, or 6-party talks from North Korea somewhere. And they will use the time of their choosing. They're not in a rush when we're distracted. Maybe we have an economic crisis. Maybe we have a crisis in Pakistan. Maybe an embassy of ours, there's some issue, or an ambassador gets killed, or there's some demonstration. It's not like this is unthinkable. So these are issues that it's a judgment call. Now, where does this leave us? Where it leaves us, in my view, is that, and here I think things took a regrettably wrong turn in last month, and it saddened me very much. And I happened to be, it was the day my New Yorker piece came out, and I was actually in Netanyahu's office, and it was late at night, and I saw him, and I want to be clear, I talked to him for a few minutes, but I was actually coming to see an aide of his and have dinner with him. And he and I have differences over time to time over issues, and we talk it out. But Netanyahu was clearly upset by statements that were made in the United States that got no press, maybe in the Baltimore Sun or the Washington Post or the New York Times, but made a lot of news in Israel when the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dempsey, says, we're not going to be complicit in the Israeli strike. The Israelis hear the word complicit, and they think that means complicit in a crime. And they tend to idealize the American structure. I know this sounds strange to you, but they think everything, they think Israel is a shtibel, like a little synagogue where everyone's yelling at each other. But they think America is this grand cathedral that one guy sits in the Oval Office, he pushes a button, and a general pops up and he says, say these words. Now, you would think with all the back and forth, they'd have a more nuanced view, but that's the way it is. So they saw things as a personal rebuke to them, to the prime minister. Now, what I think he should have done is pick up the phone to the president. You have an issue? Call the president of the United States. Instead, he hit back publicly and said, if you're putting a red light on Israel, you have no moral right, you have no more right to put a red line on Israel if you don't put a red line in front of the Iranians. Because the red line he wanted was on the issue of this 20%. Now, I think that should have been done quietly. And my key point here is both sides needed a little humility in approaching this issue. It doesn't mean we should have iron resolve. Don't get me wrong. We need iron resolve. But we should not be fighting in public between the United States and Israel. I feel on this issue for 2 reasons for the Israeli perspective and a few reasons from the American side. From the Israeli side, there's no substitute for intimacy with the United States of America. The world's only superpower, and there is a ton of interaction. And the people I can tell you who were the most nervous about the public statements were the defense ministry. I was there the next day, and senior people, they were scared. They go, what are we going to war with America for? So I think that, and the second thing, more importantly to me, is that the Iranians win when America and Israel are fighting publicly. Because what is Iran supposed to think? If we're going and the Israelis are going and arguing with each other, then they're going to think, hello, even America's best friend Israel doesn't think the US is going to strike. And they will be emboldened. Why should we let the Iranians win? Why is that not interest? So I was very happy that there was a phone call with the president and the prime minister, and there's been 2 phone calls now, and there have been some quiet visits that have not gotten media attention, thankfully, to try to find some common thresholds. Because the idea of a red line is not about a public ultimatum. It's about a way that's credible, that Iran believes the US is credible in dealing with this issue. That they know that there's a line they should not pass. And we should be humble too on the American side. Because let's be honest, our track record in stopping nuclear states, not good, not good. Yes, we bought off the Libyans through sanctions and other things. But we didn't stop Pakistan, we didn't stop North Korea, And has been said by others, the Prime Minister came to me, he says, I credit you, David, I quote you. But I said, I don't really deserve the credit. There's another guy, Eli Levita, who was an Israeli guy, who said it, well, which is too early, oops, too late. And our track record isn't great. And also, the idea of international guarantees has not been fantastic. If you remember, in 1967 was the fateful time before the 67 war. Abba Eban was asked by Levi Eshkol, the Prime Minister of Israel, to make a trip, to go to De Gaulle, to go to the Prime Minister of England, and to come to see LBJ. And to De Gaulle, he said, you made a commitment in 1957 that if the Straits of Tiran were blocked again by Nasser, you would intervene. And De Gaulle said, look, I made that commitment. France made that commitment in 57, but that was 57, now we're in 67. And clearly, the difference was that the Algeria crisis was solved. France was accepted back into the Arab world once Algeria was solved. It was no longer a pariah like it was in the 50s when it had a close relationship with Israel. The Dimona reactor came out of that. So that was that. Then he gets to LBJ. And LBJ said, look, they didn't have any records of the commitment. And they had to go to see Eisenhower, the retirement home. He was living in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, and right near the battlefield. And they brought back the piece of paper. Oh yes, we do have a commitment to you, but we can't really do it because we got a war in Vietnam. And my relations with the Congress are terrible after the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, all this. So basically Israel was on its own. And I would argue that ever since then, Israel's view of international guarantees is that there's no guarantee that can guarantee a guarantee. And that they felt that that really sealed, I would argue, Israel's ethos of self-reliance. So we have to be humble, not just because our track record is bad with North Korea and Pakistan, but in terms of dealing with Israel, as great a friend as the U.S. is, and there's no greater friend of Israel than the United States, that goes without saying, and the amount of security assistance and financial assistance. But when the chips were down, we weren't there, even though we said we would be. So we have to be humble as well. So it seems to me that we need a situation that to bring this now full circle to the Syria issue. And what do we need to know on Iran? Will we know if there's progress on Iran, if they break out, if they try to go from reactor-grade fuel to weapons-grade fuel, which is the key element for the bomb? Will we know it in time, and will we act on what we know? Or will we be preoccupied with other crises? That's the sort of issues that we need to know more from the candidates for president who are busy with a lot of other issues. But that's what it really boils down to, in my view, which is how will we know if Iran breaks out? And what will we act, how will we act on it? Everyone's first choice is solve this peacefully. Nobody wants war. Nobody. And the hope is that diplomacy and sanctions work. The second choice of Israel is clearly that the United States is a superpower. This extends beyond Israel. Yes, Israel doesn't want the U.S. fighting for Israel. But this is not just about Israel. This is about the whole future of the Middle East. Huge. And for moral reasons, Israel's never asked the United States to lift the finger because it's not right. And strategically, the basis of U.S.-Israel relations is no American has ever died for Israel. And therefore, it's important that Israel does its own fighting. But this is a different sort of situation that at stake is far more than Israel. So Israel would like to back off, let the United States handle it. But its third option is you don't always get your first choice and second choice in life. You might be left with your third choice. Just as the way the Israelis were in 2007 when they had to handle this issue on their own. So my prayer is that as we go forward in this crisis, that the U.S. and Israel work together quietly, without public statements going back and forth, neither by Netanyahu or by the president, but that they work quietly. Don't give Iran any satisfaction. Reach common benchmarks that are credible, that you stand behind, and then try to find a way that if indeed Iran doesn't accept yes for an answer in the talks, they don't accept civil nuclear power, which they say they want, we in the U.S. unite our allies in an alternate plan. But we do not want to live under the shadow of the nuclear Iran. So it's a prayer that this is solved peacefully. I'm not saying I know that it will, But I'm convinced that there are enough people on both sides of the ocean who are focused on this. You'd have to be an air traffic controller to keep up with the number of visits back and forth, not to mention all the video conferencing, the secure line video conferencing. People are amazing on both sides to make this work. People say, David, are you depressed? You work on these issues, they're so complicated. You see all the threats, the challenges. And I have really faith in the resilience of the American people, the people of Israel. There are a lot of people who might, seek our demise in both countries. But ultimately, I think that Israel's will to live is greater than its enemies' will to die. And in the most literal sense, therefore, Am Yisrael Chai. Thank you all very much.